It began as the faintest whisper in the marrow of my bones, an uneasy vibration that I couldn't shake. For years, I lived in the shadow of my grandmother, a woman as stern as iron and twice as unyielding. Her house, perched on a hill overlooking a forest that seemed to stretch into eternity, was both a fortress and a prison. I was her ward, bound to her by blood and necessity. My parents' untimely deaths left me with no choice but to live under her roof and, by extension, her rule. Her house was a labyrinth of silence and control. Every corner seemed to echo with her presence, her gaze, her judgment. The air inside felt heavy, as though the walls themselves bore witness to her disdain for me. She ruled her home like a monarch, her voice a sharp blade that could cut through the thickest silence. Her words, often laced with contempt, weighed heavier on my soul than any physical blow could. To her, I was a burden, a responsibility she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. She reminded me of this constantly, each remark chiseling away at my sense of self. I grew up in the confines of her disdain, my existence reduced to a series of tasks and scoldings. Days blurred into years, marked by her sharp orders and my silent compliance. There was no warmth in her affection, no tenderness in her care. And yet, I survived, finding solace in the smallest moments of reprieve. I became adept at slipping beneath her notice, moving quietly through the house, avoiding the sharp edge of her words whenever I could. But even under her oppressive gaze, there were moments of rebellion, small acts of defiance that I clung to like lifelines. I would sneak out into the woods at dusk, the only time I felt free. The forest became my sanctuary, its whispering trees and rustling leaves a stark contrast to the cold, harsh walls of her home. The woods were alive, vibrant, and full of secrets. I would wander for hours, letting the sounds of nature drown out the echoes of her voice in my mind. It was in those woods that I began to dream of escape, of a life unshackled from her cruelty. The dream started small, a cabin hidden deep in the forest, far from her reach, where I could live on my own terms. But as the years went by, the dreams grew bolder, tinged with a desire not just to escape but to confront her, to make her feel the weight of her actions. Yet, these thoughts remained buried deep within me, unspoken and unacted upon, simmering beneath the surface like embers waiting for a spark. And so, the days went on, each one a mirror of the last, until the monotony of my existence became its own kind of prison. But even in that monotony, I began to notice things. Small cracks in her armor, fleeting moments of vulnerability that hinted at something more beneath her rigid exterior. Her hands, which had once seemed so strong, trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was watching. There was a hesitation in her voice on certain mornings, as though she'd been speaking to ghosts. The forest remained my refuge, a place where I could breathe, dream, and plan. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized that my sanctuary was not enough. I wanted more than just an escape. I wanted freedom. And so, the seeds of rebellion took root, their growth slow and steady, nurtured by years of suppressed anger and unfulfilled longing. In the end, it was not a single event that set everything into motion, but a series of small moments, each one adding to the weight of the inevitable. The storm was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the trembling of the trees, in the whisper of the wind. And when it came, it would change everything. The day began as unremarkable as any other, the sky a dull gray that mirrored the monotony of my life. I woke to the sound of her voice calling my name, sharp and insistent, cutting through the morning quiet. Her commands were familiar, the cadence of her displeasure as predictable as the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Yet, there was a new edge to her tone that morning, a sharpness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "Get downstairs. Now." I stumbled out of bed, my limbs heavy with sleep, and made my way to the kitchen. She stood by the counter, her back to me, the lines of her posture rigid. The room was thick with the scent of burnt toast, the acrid smell curling around my nostrils. I noticed her hand gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Something was wrong. "I told you to clean the pantry yesterday," she said without turning around. Her voice was low, but there was an undercurrent of something volatile beneath it. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" The pantry. I had forgotten. The memory of her instructions surfaced briefly in my mind, swallowed almost immediately by the haze of exhaustion and routine. My silence was answer enough. She turned to face me, her eyes narrowed, the familiar look of disappointment etched deeply into her features. "You're useless," she said, her words striking like a lash. "Do you think this house runs itself? That you can just do as you please?" I bit back the retort that rose in my throat, swallowing the bitterness like poison. This was a script we had followed countless times before, and I knew my role well. But as her words washed over me, I felt something shift. It wasn't defiance, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet resolve taking root in the shadow of her anger. That night, I slipped into the forest again. The trees welcomed me with their familiar embrace, their branches whispering secrets to the stars. I wandered deeper than I ever had before, my feet carrying me to places uncharted. The air grew cooler, the ground softer beneath my steps. And then I saw it, a clearing bathed in moonlight, the center of which stood an ancient oak tree. Its roots twisted and coiled like veins, its branches stretching high into the heavens. I approached the tree, drawn to it by an inexplicable pull. There was something sacred about it, something that felt both ancient and alive. As I placed my hand against its rough bark, a sense of calm washed over me, easing the tension that had coiled in my chest. In that moment, I made a silent vow. This place, this moment, would be the beginning of something new. I would find a way to reclaim my life, to break free from the chains that bound me. When I returned home, the house was silent. She had gone to bed, her door shut tight against the world. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of something I couldn't name, a fire kindling in the depths of my soul. And though I didn't know how or when, I knew one thing for certain: the storm was coming, and I would be ready. The morning after my return from the clearing was marked by a strange stillness. The usual barked orders and sharp glares from my grandmother were replaced by something quieter, almost subdued. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick played by my tired mind. But as the hours wore on, her silence began to feel deliberate, as though she were weighing something heavy in her mind. I busied myself with the usual chores, my hands scrubbing, sweeping, and sorting on autopilot. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes were following me, tracing my movements with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. When I glanced at her, she would look away, feigning disinterest, but the weight of her gaze lingered. At lunch, she spoke at last, her voice softer than usual but no less firm. "You've been spending a lot of time in the woods." The statement hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting in the space between us. I froze mid-bite, my fork hovering above my plate. Her tone was laced with curiosity, but there was an edge to it, a hint of suspicion that made my stomach tighten. "I like the quiet," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. She narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The quiet won't do you any good. You've got work to do here. This house doesn't keep itself." There it was again, her way of reminding me that my existence was tied to hers, that my worth was measured solely by what I could do for her. I nodded, swallowing the retort that burned on my tongue. There was no point in arguing. I had learned that lesson long ago. But her words stayed with me throughout the day, mingling with the memory of the ancient oak and the vow I had made beneath its branches. The contrast between the suffocating walls of her home and the freedom I felt in the forest was stark, and it fueled a growing determination within me. I began to think of the clearing not just as a refuge, but as a symbol of everything I yearned for: freedom, peace, and the chance to reclaim my identity. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows of the forest stretched long and dark, I returned to the oak. The clearing was just as I had left it, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. I sat at the base of the tree, my back against its sturdy trunk, and let the stillness seep into my bones. For the first time in years, I felt truly at ease, as though the weight of my grandmother's presence had been lifted, if only temporarily. As I sat there, I began to think about her, about the moments of vulnerability I had glimpsed in her, the cracks in her armor that hinted at something more. The memories came unbidden. The time I caught her staring out the window with tears in her eyes, her hands clutching an old photograph, the way her voice softened when she thought I was asleep, as though speaking to someone long gone. These moments were fleeting, but they planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Who was she, really? Was she simply a bitter, unkind woman who took pleasure in my suffering? Or was there something deeper driving her actions? I didn't have the answers, but the questions lingered, unsettling and persistent. When I returned home, the house was dark and silent, save for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Her door was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorframe, before peeking inside. She was sitting at her desk, her back to me, her head bowed over a stack of papers. The sight of her like this, small, almost fragile, caught me off guard. She looked up suddenly, as though sensing my presence, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "Go to bed," she said finally, her voice lacking its usual bite. I nodded, retreating to my room, but sleep did not come easily that night. My mind churned with questions, my heart heavy with the weight of conflicting emotions. The storm was coming, but its shape and direction remained a mystery. All I knew was that something was shifting, both within me and between us, and there was no turning back. The days following my discovery of the oak clearing were marked by an unusual rhythm, a push and pull between the suffocating walls of my grandmother's house and the liberating embrace of the forest. Each step into the woods felt like slipping out of a noose, the air cleaner, the light softer, and the weight on my chest easing with every rustling leaf. But the reprieve never lasted. Always, I returned to the house, to her, to the unspoken battles that defined our existence. Her demeanor shifted subtly, a change so slight I might not have noticed if I weren't already on edge. The sharpness of her words remained, but there was something else, a lingering pause before she spoke, a faint quiver in her hands when she thought I wasn't looking. At first, I dismissed it as wishful thinking, but the more I observed, the harder it became to ignore. Was it guilt? Fear? Or something I couldn't yet name? One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the sitting room, I stumbled upon a box tucked away in the corner. It was unmarked, its lid slightly ajar as if it had been hastily hidden. Inside, I found photographs, black and white images of faces I didn't recognize, their expressions caught in moments of joy and sorrow. There were letters, too, written in a hand that wasn't hers. The ink had faded, but the words remained, their meaning obscured by time and context. I was about to return the box to its place when her voice cut through the quiet. "What are you doing?" I froze, the box still in my hands. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, though her eyes burned with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Just cleaning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her gaze shifted to the box, and for a moment, something flickered across her face. Anger, fear, or perhaps both. She crossed the room in 2 swift strides, snatching the box from my hands and clutching it to her chest. "Stay out of my things," she said, her voice low and taut. Without another word, she turned and left, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hall. That night, I lay awake, the image of her clutching the box etched into my mind. What was in it that she was so desperate to hide? And why did it matter so much to her? The questions gnawed at me, feeding the restless energy that had taken root since my time in the clearing. I felt as though I were on the brink of something. A revelation, a breaking point, but I couldn't yet see the shape of it. The following morning, I resolved to confront her, though I didn't yet know how. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. I found her in the kitchen, seated at the table with a cup of tea. She didn't look up as I entered, her focus fixed on the swirling steam. "Who were they?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. She stiffened but didn't respond. I took a step closer, emboldened by her lack of reaction. "The people in the photographs," I continued. "The ones in the box." Her hand trembled as she set the cup down. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze distant, as though she were looking at something only she could see. "They're none of your concern," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was a crack in her composure, a vulnerability that made her seem almost human. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the tremor in her voice, or the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of whatever memories she carried. Instead, I turned and left, the tension between us heavier than ever. As I stepped into the forest later that day, the clearing felt different, almost expectant. The oak tree stood as it always had, its branches reaching skyward like arms outstretched in prayer. I sat beneath it, my thoughts racing. The box, the photographs, her reaction, they were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet assemble. But one thing was clear, the answers I sought were tied to her, to the life she had lived before I was thrust into her care. The forest offered no answers, only the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. But it did offer clarity, a space to breathe and think. And as I sat there, the weight of my anger began to shift. It didn't lessen, not entirely, but it changed shape, tinged now with curiosity and something that felt perilously close to empathy. By the time I returned home, the house was dark, the windows casting long shadows across the floor. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand resting on the doorknob. The clearing had given me a reprieve, but it was temporary. The storm I had felt brewing was drawing closer, its presence palpable in the stillness of the night. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that the answers I sought would come at a cost. What that cost would be, I couldn't yet say. But as I stepped inside, I resolved to face it, whatever it might be. The storm was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace. The storm arrived, not with thunderclaps and lightning tearing through the heavens, but in the silence of an early dawn. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, muting the world, forcing you to listen to the voices within. I woke to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and insistent, as if my body was aware of something my mind had yet to grasp. Her house was as it always had been, cold, unyielding, and steeped in shadows. But that morning, as I moved through its familiar corridors, it felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. The photographs on the walls, the furniture worn smooth by time, all seemed to watch me with knowing eyes. This house, her fortress, was on the brink of something it couldn't contain. I found her in the kitchen, as I often did. She was seated at the table, her back to me, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The room smelled of coffee, strong and bitter, its steam curling in ghostly tendrils above the chipped mug in front of her. She didn't acknowledge my presence as I entered, didn't look up when I sat across from her. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the ticking of the clock the only sound. I studied her face, etched with lines that spoke of a life lived in resistance to the world. Her hands, so often clenched in anger or authority, now rested limply against the tabletop. There was an unfamiliar softness to her, a vulnerability that felt out of place. It was as if the years of bitterness had worn her down to this, the barest remnants of a once formidable figure. "Why do you hate me?" The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. They hung in the air, raw and jagged, cutting through the silence like a blade. Her eyes flicked to mine, startled. For a moment, I saw something in them I couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or the shadow of it. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though weighing the weight of her response. "I don't hate you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never hated you." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "Then what is this? The way you've treated me, the way you've spoken to me all these years? If that's not hate, then what is it?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, and she sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "It's fear," she said. "Fear of losing control. Fear of failing you. Fear of becoming like my own mother." The confession struck me like a physical blow. I had never considered the possibility that her cruelty was born of anything other than malice. But as I looked at her now, stripped of her armor, I saw the truth of her words. Her life had been a series of battles, each one leaving scars that she had carried into our relationship. She had been shaped by her past as surely as I had been shaped by her. "I didn't know," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of realization. "I didn't understand." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I didn't know how to show you anything else." For the first time, I saw her not as my oppressor but as a person, a deeply flawed, deeply human person. And in that moment, I made a choice. I chose to let go of the anger that had anchored me to her, to our shared pain. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something lighter, something freer. We sat together in the quiet, the storm inside me finally abating. The house, for all its coldness, felt a little warmer. The walls, once oppressive, seemed to soften. And as the morning light filtered through the kitchen window, I realized that we had both weathered the storm. We had survived. And for the first time, I believed we could begin again.